The Valdrian Hegemony had perfected the art of civilized conquest over 3 millennia, and they were quite proud of their efficiency. No messy orbital bombardments, no tedious ground wars, no unfortunate incidents that might upset the Galactic Ethics Committee over their morning stimulants. Instead, they employed what their PR department cheerfully termed cultural integration protocols, a delightfully euphemistic way of describing systematic intimidation wrapped in diplomatic courtesy. The process was elegantly simple. Step 1. Identify a primitive world with resources worth extracting. Step 2. Establish peaceful contact and offer membership in their glorious civilization. Step 3. When the natives inevitably declined, because they always did, the ungrateful creatures implement the standard demonstration of hegemony superiority through carefully orchestrated displays of technological and physical dominance. Most species capitulated by Step 4. The stubborn ones rarely lasted until Step 6. Earth, that unremarkable blue-green marble orbiting a forgettably average star, had seemed destined for the express lane through this well-oiled machine. Initial surveys indicated a fractured civilization of bipedal mammals who had barely mastered interplanetary travel and still killed each other over ideological differences and resource distribution. Their technology was primitive, their military forces laughably disorganized, and their political structures so chaotic that the hegemony's xenosociologists had initially wondered if the species possessed any form of higher intelligence at all. The humans had surprised absolutely no one by declining the hegemony's generous offer of membership. What had surprised everyone was their response, a polite counter-proposal suggesting the hegemony kindly remove themselves from Earth's solar system before someone got hurt. The audacity was almost refreshing, like watching a particularly bold insect threaten to sting a starship. Which brought them to today's entertainment. Ambassador Nexor Valdris, third-ranked diplomat of the hegemony and possessor of what he considered an impressive collection of conquered species surrender documents, adjusted his ceremonial robes and reviewed the file on his desk. The human delegation consisted of a single representative. Apparently their species suffered from the delusion that quantity mattered less than quality. How charmingly naive. The human female had arrived precisely on schedule, because humans seemed obsessed with temporal precision despite their inability to grasp the larger temporal scale of galactic politics. She stood barely chest-high to Valdris's impressive 2.5-meter frame, her slight build making her appear even more fragile against the imposing architecture of his private chamber. The room had been specifically designed for these encounters, soaring ceilings that dwarfed visitors, walls lined with trophies from successfully integrated worlds, and lighting that cast the ambassador in dramatic shadows while leaving guests feeling exposed and insignificant. The human seemed remarkably unimpressed by the theatrical setup. She examined the trophy wall with what appeared to be professional interest rather than intimidation, occasionally nodding as if mentally cataloging items for a museum exhibit. Her attire was disappointingly practical, a simple black suit that suggested she had missed the memo about this being a formal surrender ceremony. "Welcome to Hegemony Space," Valdris began, his voice carrying the resonant authority that had convinced 47 other species to abandon their foolish independence. "I trust your journey was educational." The human turned from her examination of a crystalline artifact that had once been sacred to the Carillion people before they learned to appreciate hegemony governance. "Naturally. Educational is one word for it," she replied, her tone carrying an odd note that Valdris couldn't quite identify. "Amusement, perhaps. Surely not mockery. That would be suicide. I assume you've come to discuss your world's inevitable integration into our civilization," the ambassador continued, settling into his throne-like chair with practiced ease. The furniture had been selected specifically for its ability to make him appear larger and more imposing, a psychological advantage that had proven devastatingly effective across dozens of species. The human remained standing, hands clasped loosely behind her back in a posture that somehow managed to appear both respectful and completely unsubmissive. "Actually, I'm here to discuss your inevitable departure from our solar system. We appreciate the visit, truly, but it's time to move along. Nothing personal, we're just not interested in what you're selling." Valdris felt his facial ridges twitch with suppressed irritation. The formula called for gradual escalation, not immediate defiance. Most species at least pretended to consider the offer before rejecting it. This human seemed to be skipping several steps in the carefully choreographed dance of conquest. "I fear you misunderstand the nature of this meeting," he said, rising from his chair with fluid grace. At his full height he towered over the human like a monument of civilized authority. "This is not a negotiation. This is an explanation of how your integration will proceed. Your compliance is expected." The human tilted her head slightly, studying him with the sort of detached curiosity usually reserved for interesting but ultimately harmless specimens. "Expected by whom, exactly? Because I have to tell you, Ambassador, we humans have a long and colorful history of disappointing expectations. It's practically a cultural tradition." Valdris took a measured step forward, close enough that his shadow fell across the human's small form. In his experience, proximity was often more effective than outright threats. Most beings possessed an instinctive recognition of predator and prey relationships, and his species had evolved from apex hunters. The psychological effect was usually immediate and decisive. The human didn't step back. She didn't even blink. She simply stood there studying his face with that same mildly interested expression, as if he were a particularly complex puzzle she was considering whether to solve. "Your world will be protected under hegemony law," Valdris continued, allowing a slight edge to creep into his voice. "Your people will be educated in proper civilization. Your resources will be managed by those qualified to utilize them efficiently. Surely you can see the benefits of such an arrangement." "Oh, absolutely," the human replied, her tone suggesting she could indeed see something, though perhaps not what the ambassador intended. "Managed resources, proper education, protection under your law. It sounds wonderful, comprehensive. Tell me, Ambassador, in your experience, do the managed ever develop a tendency to bite the hand that manages them?" It was at that moment, standing close enough to smell the strange chemical signatures of human biology and looking down into those peculiarly bright eyes, that Ambassador Valdris made the decision that would reshape galactic politics for the next century. He reached for her neck, not to harm, naturally, but to demonstrate the casual ease with which he could do so. It was a gesture of dominance as old as civilization itself, a physical reminder of the power dynamics at play. The human female looked up at his approaching hand with something that might have been anticipation. "How interesting," she murmured, and Valdris suddenly realized he might have misunderstood something fundamental about the species he was attempting to intimidate. What happened next would later be analyzed by xenobiologists, military strategists, and diplomatic historians across 17 different star systems. The consensus, reached after months of heated academic debate, was that Ambassador Valdris had committed what scholars termed a catastrophic cultural miscalculation. The more colloquial term, favored by military personnel and bar patrons throughout hegemony space, was spectacular stupidity. Valdris's hand moved with the practiced confidence of someone who had performed this gesture dozens of times before. The motion was fluid, almost ceremonial, a graceful arc designed to demonstrate his reach, his size advantage, his complete control over the physical space they shared. It was theater, really, choreographed intimidation, that had never failed to produce the desired psychological effect. The human female watched his approach with the sort of focused attention that should have been his first warning. Her eyes tracked the movement of his hand with professional interest, cataloging angle, speed, and trajectory like a technician analyzing equipment specifications. Most beings displayed fear at this point, or at least the physiological signs of stress. Elevated heart rates, rapid breathing, defensive posturing, all the standard mammalian responses to perceived threats. This human did none of those things. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly to her left foot and smiled. The smile was Valdris's second warning, though he was far too committed to his performance to recognize it as such. It wasn't the expression of someone facing intimidation, it was the look of a professional recognizing familiar work conditions. When his fingers were perhaps 15 centimeters from her throat, the human moved. She didn't dodge or retreat, movements that would have allowed him to maintain the psychological advantage while demonstrating her evasion pattern. Instead, she stepped forward, closing the distance between them while her right hand rose in a motion so precise it appeared almost mechanical. Her fingers found the nerve cluster at the base of Valdris's extended arm with surgical accuracy. The touch was gentle, almost delicate, barely more than a caress across his forearm. The effect was immediate and comprehensive. Every muscle from his shoulder to his fingertips locked in a spasm of excruciating paralysis. His entire arm transformed from an instrument of dominance into a monument to poor decision-making. Valdris had experienced pain before, naturally. His species had evolved from predators, and predators understood the educational value of discomfort. But this was something entirely different, a precise, targeted agony that seemed to bypass his natural pain tolerance entirely. It was pain with academic credentials, suffering that had clearly studied for its degree in neural disruption. "Oh good," the human said conversationally, maintaining her gentle grip on his arm while Valdris struggled to process the impossibility of his situation. "You do have similar nerve structures. I wasn't entirely certain, what with the different evolutionary paths and all. It's always awkward when you try these techniques and nothing happens. Very embarrassing professional." Valdris attempted to speak, but the paralysis had extended into his chest muscles, reducing his intended commands to a series of wheezing sounds that would have been undignified under any circumstances and were positively humiliating under the. "Now I realize this is probably confusing," the human continued, adjusting her grip slightly. The minor repositioning sent fresh waves of neural feedback cascading through Valdris's nervous system, each one a reminder that his understanding of the power dynamics in this room had been fundamentally flawed. "Your species obviously has different greeting customs. Reaching for someone's neck might be perfectly polite where you come from, like a handshake or a bow or those cheek-kissing things some cultures do." She paused, tilting her head as if considering this possibility with genuine academic interest. "Though I have to say, if neck-grabbing is your standard, diplomatic greeting, your species has some fascinating approaches to international relations. Really makes you wonder about your domestic policy." The ambassador's vision began to develop interesting sparkly edges as his circulatory system struggled to adapt to the various muscle groups that were no longer accepting neural instruction. Through the growing haze, he became dimly aware that his security protocols had failed to account for threats that measured barely 1.5 meters in height and appeared to weigh less than his ceremonial robes. "The thing is," the human continued, maintaining her casual tone while keeping Valdris suspended in his private neurological disaster, "where I come from, reaching for someone's neck without permission falls under what we call assault. It's considered rather rude, antisocial even. So naturally, I responded according to my cultural programming." With her free hand, she gestured toward the door of the ambassador's private chambers. "I assume you have security personnel stationed outside. They're probably wondering about now why their scanning equipment is registering unusual biosignatures from in here. Elevated stress indicators, irregular neural patterns, that sort of thing." Valdris managed a strangled sound that might have been agreement, though it could equally well have been the noise his digestive system made when experiencing existential terror. "Excellent," the human said brightly, "because I'd hate for this to escalate into a proper diplomatic incident. Those are so messy, and the paperwork is absolutely dreadful. Much better to resolve these cultural misunderstandings at the personal level, don't you think?" The door to the chambers dilated with a soft hiss, admitting 3 Hegemony security officers, who had clearly been monitoring the situation and had finally decided that unusual biosignatures warranted investigation. They entered with weapons drawn and expressions of professional competence, prepared to deal with whatever threat had compromised their ambassador's safety. They stopped short when they discovered their ambassador suspended in an apparently casual conversation with the human diplomat, his face an interesting shade of purple and his entire body locked in what appeared to be a voluntary yoga position. "Ah, perfect timing," the human said, nodding politely to the security team. "Your ambassador and I were just discussing cultural differences. He was demonstrating your species' approach to personal space, and I was showing him some of our defensive techniques. Very educational all around." The senior security officer, a veteran of 17 successful integration campaigns, found himself facing a situation that had not been covered in any of his training protocols. The human appeared completely unthreatened. The ambassador appeared to be experiencing some form of medical emergency, and the room's atmospheric readings indicated no weapons discharge, no chemical agents, and no energy weapons activation. "Release the ambassador immediately," the officer commanded, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty that suggested he wasn't entirely sure what he was commanding her to release.
or how? Of course, the human replied pleasantly, though I should mention that the human nervous system has some interesting quirks. Sudden releases of pressure from nerve clusters can cause what we call rebound effects, temporary paralysis, uncontrolled muscle spasms, occasionally, some short-term memory disruption. Nothing permanent, but it can be rather dramatic to watch. She looked thoughtfully at the still paralyzed ambassador. Then again, gradual release takes much longer and can be quite uncomfortable for the subject. Ambassador, do you have a preference? I'm happy to accommodate either approach. Valdrian made a sound that definitely wasn't linguistic, but nevertheless conveyed his strong preference for any approach that would restore his ability to breathe normally. The human nodded understandingly. Gradual release it is, much more diplomatic. She smiled at the security officer. This might take a while. You gentlemen might want to make yourselves comfortable. Perhaps we could discuss your species integration policies while we wait. I find cultural exchange so fascinating, don't you?
The next few minutes provided what military historians would later describe as a masterclass in tactical miscalculation. The security team, faced with a situation that defied their considerable training in crowd control, riot suppression, and standard intimidation protocol, made the decision that seemed most logical given their understanding of primitive species and basic physics. They would simply overwhelm the small human through superior numbers and firepower. This decision demonstrated the sort of linear thinking that had made the hegemony remarkably successful against conventional opponents and spectacularly unprepared for unconventional ones. The senior officer gestured to his subordinates with the practiced coordination of a team that had performed similar extractions dozens of times. The plan was elegantly simple: flank the human, force her to release the ambassador, and escort her to a detention facility where she could contemplate the wisdom of assaulting hegemony officials. Standard procedure, really, refined through decades of successful implementation. The human watched their positioning with the same professional interest she had shown the ambassador's initial approach. Her grip on Valdrian remained steady, maintaining just enough pressure to keep him suspended in his personal neurological nightmare, while leaving her completely free to observe the tactical situation developing around her. "Oh, I see," she said, nodding appreciatively as the officers moved into formation. Coordinated flanking maneuver, elevated weapon positions, psychological pressure through numerical superiority. Classic textbook approach. Your military training is quite thorough. The leftmost officer, a decorated veteran whose service record included successful operations on 12 different worlds, found himself momentarily confused by what sounded suspiciously like professional critique. Most primitive species either cowered or raged when faced with superior firepower. This human appeared to be conducting a tactical analysis. Your species has obviously studied group combat dynamics, she continued conversationally, adjusting her stance in a way that somehow managed to look both relaxed and impossibly balanced. Though I have to ask, and this is purely academic curiosity, you understand, how much experience do your forces have against opponents who've been specifically trained in anti-multiple attacker scenarios? The senior officer paused, weapon trained on the human's center mass, suddenly aware that this question felt less like idle curiosity and more like the sort of professional inquiry one expert might pose to another. "Release the ambassador," he repeated, though with noticeably less conviction than before. "Certainly," the human replied pleasantly. "Though I should probably mention that releasing pressure points while under threat triggers what we call defensive cascade protocol. It's a physiological response that's rather difficult to control once activated. Something about evolutionary programming and threat assessment algorithms built into our nervous systems." She smiled apologetically at the officer. "Basically, once my brain decides I'm in a combat situation, my body starts operating according to a different set of parameters. Much more efficient for survival purposes, but it does tend to make social situations rather awkward afterward." The ambassador, still locked in his peculiar paralysis, managed a sound that might have been intended as a warning. His security team, however, had already committed to their tactical approach, and were disinclined to interpret vocalizations that sounded like a malfunctioning atmospheric processor. The rightmost officer moved first, stepping forward to establish a closer perimeter. It was a textbook advance, perfectly executed according to hegemony military doctrine. His weapon remained trained on the target. His footing was secure. His approach angle minimized the human's potential escape routes. By every measure of tactical competence, it was a flawless maneuver. The human released her grip on Ambassador Valdris. What happened next would be debated in military academies for decades, primarily because the security recordings captured everything in perfect detail while explaining absolutely nothing about how any of it was possible. The human moved with a fluid precision that seemed to violate several fundamental principles of bipedal locomotion. She flowed rather than stepped, her center of gravity shifting in ways that defied conventional understanding of mammalian musculature. The approaching officer found himself airborne before his nervous system had fully processed the transition. One moment he was executing a professionally competent tactical advance, the next he was discovering fascinating new perspectives on the ceiling architecture of the ambassador's chamber. His weapon discharged harmlessly into an expensive tapestry, depicting the glorious conquest of the Meridian colonies. The human had somehow redirected his forward momentum into a graceful arc that deposited him, with surprising gentleness, against the far wall. He slid to the floor with the bewildered expression of someone whose understanding of cause and effect had just been thoroughly revised. "Sorry about that," the human called over her shoulder while simultaneously evading the second officer's attempt at a restraining hold. "Told you about those defensive cascade protocols. Really very difficult to override once they activate." The second officer, a specialist in hand-to-hand combat, who had successfully subdued members of 17 different species, discovered that his expertise was frustratingly inadequate for dealing with an opponent who seemed to treat gravitational forces as mere suggestion. His attempt to grab her shoulder resulted in a brief educational experience in advanced leverage principles, before he joined his colleague in exploring the structural integrity of the ambassador's wall decoration. The senior officer, demonstrating the sort of adaptability that had earned him his rank, immediately shifted to ranged combat protocol. He raised his weapon, acquired target lock on the human's center mass, and prepared to end this embarrassing situation with the sort of overwhelming force that had proven effective across dozens of previous encounters with resistant population. The human, somehow aware of his targeting despite having her back turned while evading his subordinates, offered what appeared to be genuine regret. "I really wouldn't recommend that approach," she said, pivoting to face him while maintaining her impossibly fluid motion. Energy weapons in enclosed spaces tend to produce rather unpredictable results when combined with human defensive response. The officer hesitated, not from uncertainty about his tactical decision, but from a growing awareness that this engagement had departed significantly from standard parameters. The human's movements displayed a coordination and efficiency that suggested training far beyond what should have been available to a primitive species. More troubling, her responses indicated she was operating several tactical steps ahead of his team's action. "You see," the human continued, somehow managing to sound apologetic while systematically dismantling 3 armed professionals. "Humans have this unfortunate tendency to excel at violence when properly motivated. It's not something we're particularly proud of, but evolution rarely consults with ethics committees." She gestured toward Ambassador Valdris, who had collapsed into his ceremonial chair and was making remarkable progress in restoring his respiratory function. "Your ambassador's approach to diplomacy suggested he was operating under certain assumptions about human capabilities. I thought it might be educational to provide some practical demonstration." The senior officer lowered his weapon slightly, not in surrender but in the dawning recognition that this situation required a fundamental reassessment of tactical priority. Around him, his subordinates were discovering that their training in subduing primitive species had not adequately prepared them for opponents who treated conventional combat dynamics as starting points for improvisation. "Now then," the human said, brushing an imaginary speck of dust from her practical black suit while 3 hegemony security officers reconsidered their career choices, "perhaps we could return to our earlier discussion about integration policy. I have several questions about your species' approach to cultural exchange." Ambassador Valdris, having finally restored enough neural function to speak coherently, looked at his security team, looked at the unruffled human diplomat, and made what was arguably the wisest decision of his professional career. "Perhaps," he wheezed, "we should schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss alternative approaches to interspecies relations." The human smiled brightly. "How wonderfully diplomatic of you, Ambassador. I do appreciate flexibility in negotiation." News of the diplomatic incident at Station Valdor Prime spread through hegemony space with the sort of velocity typically reserved for stellar phenomena, and really good gossip. The official report,
filed by Ambassador Valdrian after considerable deliberation and several strong sedatives, described the events as a minor cultural misunderstanding resolved through enhanced dialogue protocol. The unofficial version, shared in military bars and diplomatic lounges across 17 star systems, was considerably more colorful and included several anatomical impossibilities that had somehow been made temporarily possible. The Hegemony High Command, an organization not traditionally known for its sense of humor, found itself facing what their crisis management specialists diplomatically termed an unprecedented paradigm shift in threat assessment protocol. The more direct translation, favored by junior officers and anyone not required to file formal reports, was that they had completely misunderstood what they were dealing with. The human female had been escorted from the station with full diplomatic honors, a gesture that confused absolutely everyone involved but seemed like the safest possible approach given recent events. Her departure had been remarkably cordial, featuring polite exchanges about cultural differences, sincere appreciation for the educational nature of the encounter, and a casual suggestion that future negotiations might benefit from preliminary discussions about personal space boundaries. 3 days later, every Hegemony military installation within 50 light-years received new tactical briefings labeled Human Combat Capabilities, Revised Assessment Protocol. The documents made for fascinating reading, particularly the sections dealing with unexpected kinetic redistribution techniques and neurological pressure point exploitation in non-human physiology. Several senior officers required additional sedatives after reviewing the tactical recording. Meanwhile, in the broader galactic community, other species began asking uncomfortable questions about hegemony integration methods and the accuracy of their species classification system. The Carillion Collective, still smarting from their own cultural exchange experience several decades earlier, issued a statement expressing profound interest in human approaches to diplomatic discourse. The Andromedan Trade Confederation, never known for subtlety, began advertising human-style negotiation consulting services to any species currently engaged in discussions with the hegemony. The human homeworld, apparently unaware that a single diplomatic meeting had shifted the balance of galactic politics, continued its delightfully chaotic existence. Their planetary communications networks buzzed with debates about resource allocation, territorial disputes, and whether certain entertainment programs accurately represented their species' approach to conflict resolution. The hegemony's xenosociologists, tasked with monitoring these transmissions for signs of military preparation or political coordination, found themselves increasingly convinced that humans operated according to no recognizable pattern of civilization whatsoever. Ambassador Valdrian, having recovered most of his motor functions and a significant portion of his professional dignity, submitted his final assessment to Hegemony High Command 3 weeks after the incident. The report, classified at levels typically reserved for existential threats to galactic stability, contained a single recommendation that would reshape hegemony foreign policy for the next century, suggest alternative approaches to human cultural integration. Current protocols appear suboptimal for this species. The understatement was so profound it achieved a kind of artistic beauty. The human delegation's ship had departed hegemony space precisely on schedule, because humans apparently treated temporal commitments with the same casual efficiency they applied to dismantling armed security teams. Before leaving, the female diplomat had submitted her own report to Earth's governing authorities, a document that would later be studied by xenopsychologists as a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement and dry humor. Her assessment of hegemony intentions, standard imperial expansion protocols disguised as cultural outreach programs, her evaluation of their military capabilities, impressive against conventional opponents, limited adaptability to unconventional scenarios. Her recommendation for future interactions suggest continued diplomatic engagement with emphasis on mutual respect and personal space awareness. 6 months later, the hegemony received an official communication from Earth's United Diplomatic Corps. The message was brief, professional, and contained an invitation that would have been unthinkable before the Station Valdor Prime incident. Earth offered to host a pan-galactic conference on alternative approaches to interspecies relations, with a special focus on cultural exchange without involuntary integration. 47 species responded with expressions of interest within the first week. The conference, held in Earth's Pacific archipelago for reasons the humans described as atmospheric compatibility and scenic value, became the most significant diplomatic gathering in galactic history. The Hegemony attended, naturally, though their delegation was notably larger than usual, and included several specialists in what their official roster described as enhanced personal security protocols. The human female who had triggered this unprecedented diplomatic revolution served as one of Earth's primary representatives. She delivered the opening address on defensive diplomacy and threat assessment in cross-species negotiations, a presentation that was simultaneously technical, educational, and subtly terrifying to anyone familiar with recent events at Station Valdor Prime. During the reception following her presentation, she encountered Ambassador Valdris near the refreshment station. He was sampling human cuisine with the cautious enthusiasm of someone whose understanding of human capabilities had been comprehensively revised. "Ambassador," she said pleasantly, offering the same professional smile that had preceded his educational experience in neural pressure point manipulation. "How are you finding the conference?" Valdris, demonstrating wisdom acquired through painful experience, maintained a respectful distance while responding, "Most illuminating. Your species has a remarkable talent for reframing traditional approaches to interspecies relations." "We do try to be creative," she replied, selecting something called a canapé from the refreshment display. "Though I have to say, your delegation's new approach to personal space awareness has been quite impressive. Very diplomatic of you." The ambassador nodded carefully, acutely aware that this conversation was being monitored by 17 different intelligence services and at least 3 military analysis teams. "We found your earlier cultural education quite comprehensive. The Hegemony appreciates opportunities to expand our understanding of diplomatic protocols." The human smiled, the same expression that had preceded the most significant revision of galactic politics in recent memory. "How wonderful. I do believe cultural exchange works best when all parties are genuinely committed to learning from each other." As she walked away to greet other delegates, Ambassador Valdris reflected on the curious nature of consequences and the danger of assumption. He had reached for her neck expecting to demonstrate hegemony superiority. She had reached for his pressure points and inadvertently demonstrated that the galaxy was far more interesting and dangerous than anyone had previously imagined. The conference concluded with the signing of the Terran Accords, a comprehensive framework for interspecies relations that emphasized mutual respect, cultural sensitivity, and the fundamental importance of asking permission before touching anyone's neck. The Hegemony signed with enthusiasm, having developed a profound appreciation for diplomatic alternatives to their traditional integration method. And in the end, the human female who had started it all returned to Earth with a commendation for exceptional service in advancing interspecies understanding, and a recommendation for continued cultural exchange duties with emphasis on personal safety protocols. She accepted both with the same professional demeanor she had shown while revolutionizing galactic politics, though those who knew her well noticed she seemed particularly amused by something in her private communications from the diplomatic corps. The message, later declassified by Earth's historical archives, contained a single line that perfectly captured humanity's approach to cosmic diplomacy. "Next time someone reaches for your neck, feel free to reach for whatever seems appropriate." The galaxy appears to benefit from practical demonstrations of human cultural values,